share critical ideas online. How do content creators get, let's say, unpleasant or challenging material out there when you've got these huge algorithmic and, frankly, political gatekeepers often standing in the way? The tools for suppression are getting smarter, more sophisticated all the time, and it's forcing dissenters to get pretty creative just to be heard.
Mm-hmm. And that specific creative strategy we're looking at is called algorithmic jujitsu, or AJ. So the core question really is fundamental for digital freedom, isn't it? Is this approach, which is, let's be clear, designed to bypass platform suppression and even recruit decentralized resistance, is it legitimate nonviolent dissent? Or is it actually a kind of calculated digital sabotage? Something that, authorities could increasingly frame as a threat to the system itself.
Right. I see why you'd frame it that way as potentially dangerous. But let me offer a different take. I'm going to argue that AJ is, well, maybe a necessary and pretty sophisticated tool. Perhaps it's one of the only tools left that can actually guarantee some level of transparency and distributed free expression when you're up against such coordinated corporate and governmental control. Think of it as a kind of intellectual countermove designed to use the censorship system against itself.
Okay, I approach it from a slightly different angle. I absolutely acknowledge the suppression environment is real. Creators do feel squeezed. However, I'm going to argue that AJ's core reliance on, let's call it deception, packaging content to trick the algorithms, combined with its very explicit goal of turning any enforcement action into potentially system-wide destabilization, what's known as the Hydra strategy, well, that makes it an extremely high-risk tactic. You just can't ignore the structural similarities to concepts that authorities are actively defining as threats these days.
Well, the algorithm, the robot looking for those keywords, often flags and buries it before anyone really sees it. AJ isn't about violence. It's not about direct attack. It's about tactical evasion. It's about forcing the system to kind of expose itself. The main mechanism here is what's called linguistic evasion through an algorithmic redirect. So instead of a direct hit, you redirect the argument. You use safe, almost neutral, observational language. The creator takes that sensitive, critical content, the unpleasant stuff, and frames it not as a political broadside, but as, say, a data-driven case study of my YouTube channel's analytics. The title might be something like, "My audience retention metrics are broken, and here's the quantitative proof."
That kind of title tends to slip past the initial AI filters because it sounds like technical troubleshooting, right? It allows the actual long-form critical content a chance to get distributed. The main mechanism here is what's called linguistic evasion through an algorithmic redirect. So instead of a direct hit, you redirect the argument. You use safe, almost neutral observational language. The creator takes that sensitive, critical content, the unpleasant stuff, and frames it not as a political broadside, but as, say, a data-driven case study of my YouTube channel's analytics. The title might be something like, and this approach, it's quite clever because it forces the gatekeepers to deal with quantitative evidence, the actual receipts, as they say, proving platform bias, rather than just dismissing, emotional arguments. It effectively uses the audience as the debate forum. You get high engagement, comments light up discussing the real topic, and that massive positive signal actually pushes the algorithm to keep distributing it.
Okay, that's a strong case for its cleverness, I'll grant you. But I'd frame the intent quite differently. The documents outlining this technique, they explicitly call AJ a simple sabotage playbook, and it's aimed, quote, directly at the heart of gatekeepers. The stated purpose isn't just to start a conversation. It seems designed to guarantee an unavoidable win for the creator, no matter how the platform reacts. And that is inherently destabilizing. This win is engineered through a couple of things: the Streisand effect trap and preemptive martyrdom. The whole setup baits the platform. If they ignore the video, fine, the message gets out. But if they do suppress it, take it down, then the creator becomes a martyr, and the act of suppression itself becomes the loudest message, proving the creator's point about bias. The platform kind of loses either way. But the biggest threat, I think, is the Hydra strategy. If the channel gets banned, the plan is to immediately recruit, quote, 1,000 people to start channels immediately to echo the message. This isn't just criticism anymore. It's a calculated flood aimed at causing the worst outcome for the controlling entity. That moves it beyond critique into, well, active systemic interference. It's the difference between writing a sharp op-ed and maybe launching a kind of digital swarm. This win is engineered through a couple of things.
So let's focus on the ethics here for a second, because it really turns on this idea of, the integrity of communication. How is reframing what is often a deeply political or economic critique the real point of the video? How is framing that as just a benign, data-driven case study of your YouTube channel's analytics? How is that genuine dissent? I'm sorry, I don't quite accept that it's fundamentally deceptive in a way that undermines it. Let me explain why I see it differently.
But the tactic relies on that initial deception, doesn't it? The packaging is neutral data talk, specifically designed to fool the system's filters. Now, maybe the human audience gets the metagame, right? They understand they're watching something designed to be, as you put it, sly but loud, to get past censorship. But the act of slipping it past the automated gatekeeper under false pretenses, that's foundational to how it gets distributed in the first place. The video only spreads initially because the system thinks it's just, routine channel talk. The deception isn't aimed at the people watching. It's aimed squarely at the platform's own infrastructure.
Okay, I'd argue it's strategically sly. Yes, absolutely. But deceptive in a damaging sense? I don't think so. It's necessary evasion, maybe, not fundamental documentation, precisely to be transparent about this dynamic. The creator posts it and basically says up front, look, platform, I predict you'll try to suppress this video because it exposes your bias. And when you inevitably do, that act of suppression will be the final piece of proof that my analysis was correct. This isn't really lying. It's more like meta-criticism. It forces the platform into a moment of self-awareness by using its own data, its own processes against itself. And crucially, it serves an educational purpose for the audience. It shows them in real time exactly how algorithmic manipulation or bias can work. The goal is to make the suppression attempt backfire instantly, that sly but loud outcome. That level of transparency to the end user, exposing the system's actions as they happen, feels like the very essence of dissent to me.
But think about the risk of political redefinition here. Let's step back from the nonviolence for a moment. Authorities like the FBI, for example, have formally identified categories like nihilistic violent extremism, and they characterize it partly by individuals who are disaffected, who believe there's no political solution, and who might seek to further societal collapse. Now, A.J. is nonviolent, okay? But the objective of that Hydra strategy, achieving this overwhelming loss of control for the gatekeepers, doesn't that structurally rhyme, at least a little, with the idea of accelerating a system's breakdown? Especially in the current political climate where, let's face it, one side often feels its ability to speak is under constant threat, and authorities seem to be tightening the definitions of what constitutes unacceptable discourse. Doesn't A.J. run a serious risk of being framed under this broad umbrella of dangerous extremism?
You're essentially teaching people replicable methods for decentralized action against established power. To a regulator, that could look an awful lot like an organized digital insurgency.
That's a fair point about the risk of framing. But I'm not fully convinced the comparison holds, because the underlying goals seem, to me, diametrically opposed. Nihilism, as you described it, often seeks chaos for chaos's sake. A.J., on the other hand, is focused on nonviolence and what could be called sabotage by teaching. The Hydra strategy isn't about societal collapse, it's about building decentralized capacity for rational communication and critical thinking. That progression, one channel becomes 1,000, potentially 1 million. That's the exact opposite of the kind of learned helplessness that some argue is cultivated by, legacy education systems or even current media structures. Think about the old Prussian model of education. The goal was arguably to instill obedience, to sort of squeeze out independent thought. Today, you could argue algorithmic control aims for a similar kind of compliance through filtering. A.J. actually seeks to restore the capacity for rational discourse that might be eroded by that system conditioning. It aims to make the populace more capable of critical thought, which is surely the antidote to the kind of despair that might lead to violence, not the cause of it.
Okay, let's analyze this strategic risk using a cybernetics lens, thinking about the system architecture.
Control systems, whether we label them the economic Leviathan or the governmental Ouroboros, they fundamentally require stability, right? Homeostasis, to operate effectively. AJ seems designed to introduce massive, uncontrollable variables into that system. Algorithmic jujitsu brings in uncontrollable blind variation, all those thousands of potential new channels, new ways of phrasing things, new evasion tactics. And it demands a response from the system. The regulatory part, the Ouroboros, it has to process this irritation through its basic code: power, non-power. It faces a choice: tolerate this growing dissent or try to crush it.
And the strategy is deliberately set up to make both of those options quite painful for the system.
Precisely, and the goal of overwhelming the system, of exceeding its requisite variety, basically, exceeding the regulator's capacity to actually cope with the sheer complexity and volume of the dissent, well, that constitutes a kind of functional attack on its operational closure. Imagine the gatekeeper as a net designed for, I don't know, catching minnows, simple, direct, protests. But now you've unleashed thousands of complex, fast-moving sharks, the 1,000 new channels all employing AJ tactics. The net just doesn't have the variety, the flexibility to handle it. It gets overwhelmed, functionally destabilized.
But that systemic fear you're describing, doesn't that actually prove the strategy's merit? If the system is so rigid, so obsessed with its own stability, its homeostasis, that it genuinely fears the decentralized spread of replicable methods and just basic self-awareness among its users, well then AJ is simply applying a necessary evolutionary pressure. It's forcing the system to adapt. You know, the economic Leviathan and the governmental Ouroboros, they are tightly coupled. They reinforce each other's need for stability and control. Exposing deep-seated bias through this sabotage by proof forces some kind of adaptation. If we just let these critical ideas, these unpleasant truths, vanish into the void because of censorship, the system just hardens, doesn't it? It becomes an unchallenged authoritarian structure. AJ tries to ensure those critical ideas don't just vanish. It forces the authorities to engage with this decentralized capacity, even if that engagement is just the act of suppression itself. In a way, it's forcing transparency by paradoxically weaponizing opacity.
So, to sum up my perspective, while the motivations behind algorithmic jujitsu might well be rooted in a genuine desire for transparency and critical discussion, the strategy's core reliance on this calculated three-option trap where the system seemingly always loses control either by letting the message spread or by creating martyrs, it feels inherently destabilizing. And in an era where political rhetoric is quick to frame strong opposition, especially sophisticated digital interference, as organized extremism, this kind of digital sabotage carries, I think, significant real-world risks regardless of its nonviolent nature. It risks creating the very kind of perceived chaos that could be used to justify even more authoritarian control down the line.
And from my side, algorithmic jujitsu isn't the cause of this tension. It's the high-stakes result of pervasive systemic censorship. It's a necessary innovation, perhaps, that weaponizes the very tools of control, the algorithms, the predictable responses, to try and regain some fundamental agency, some critical capacity for users. It's essentially a blueprint for teaching people how to resist what feels like manufactured compliance, that learned helplessness of an uncritical society. By forcing the system to reveal its own hand, its own suppression mechanisms, it arguably achieves a kind of victory for distributed communication that perhaps direct, honest discourse simply can't secure anymore in some contexts.